Why should I be ethical? I get my answer from somewhere around 300 BC. These philosophers call themselves the Stoics. And one of them was lecturing in the town square, and somebody asked about ethics. Somebody asked him, why should I be ethical? Why should I be logical? And the answer was, do you want an ethical answer? Yeah, you want an ethical answer. So it's in our nature to demand that other people be ethical. Who are you to be above so high and mighty that you don't have to be ethical? But you have to be ethical too. So it's a first principle of individual nature. That's the one that I subscribe to. And I like it because it says one thing that is very important today to explain that that the genius that people had in 300 BC has not been bested. I think the last book I read was a book that divided all of human societies into two categories: love cultures and wisdom cultures. And it was incredible to me that it is possible that the oldest cultures on the planet, and perhaps some of the largest ones, believe that wisdom is more important than the thing we call love. After all, that's a Western invention. I found it hard to believe that two people could get married and not on the basis of love, as I understand it. Joseph Campbell made a distinction between individual love and courtly love. Now, on this one, let me tell you a story. One of my earliest memories is of being sick, and the doctor came to the house to make house calls. And so I remember laying up in the bed with the covers under my chin, and I had a fever, and I have spotty memories that the doctor, my father was standing behind the doctor is speaking to my mother. And he told my mother that if I made it through by breakfast time, I would be all right. And all I could concentrate on was that word if. They weren't expecting me necessarily to make it through the night. So Dr. Hunsucker left, and a little while later the phone rang, and my mother answered the phone, and she told my father that it was the sheriff on the line. And my father was principal of the school there, and the sheriff was at a scene where one of his school buses turned over. And it was bad weather out there. And my father had to get up and leave me in that bed, which might have been my last night, and go out and tend to the other kids. That's where I grew up. You talk about love of family. I can feel that, but I don't think I feel it like you do, because I have a different kind of feeling about the community. The kids used to tease me about, well, my mother would never have left me in that bed. My mother didn't. My father would never have left me in the bed like that. I said, well, my father's got a responsibility to everybody. That's where I grew up. Now, the woman I married was a woman whose father was a doctor, and her mother was a doctor. She didn't know anything about when a disease broke out, mother or father staying at home with her. They got their little bags and they had to go out with other kids. So we were the right people to get married to each other. So I think I've got one foot in the Western world and the other foot in another world over there, because I don't understand love like I think you do. Play this game. Now, there are two movies. One is called Failsafe, and the other one's called Dr. Strangelove. I don't know if anybody has seen those movies. One is, to me, one is a comedic version of the other. But in Peter Sellers starred in Dr. Strangelove, and Henry Fonda played the president of the United States in Failsafe. What happened was, by accident, the United States bombed Russia, Moscow. And so, how does the president avert a world war, an atomic war? Okay. Well, here's what the president's solution was. He bombed New York. And his wife and 2 children were in New York, and he knew it. To save America and possibly the rest of the world, he didn't have any problems bombing his own kids and wife. Now, I've told that story before where people got up, called me a bunch of demonic names, and walked out of the room and never came back. Okay. I made a mistake of telling that story to a high school group, and I had chaos in there out of some of those kids. My mother would never do that to me. You know, and all of that. I don't know any other way to live. Okay. So I think I can maybe not see clearly, but I can reach out there and feel some of these other people who think differently about love. Love is not the answer. Okay. Not for everybody.
I was more curious going back to the equation.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry if I interpreted this incorrectly, but were you saying that knowledge through experience leads to a higher understanding of the truth?
What I'm trying to do is not my own creation. I was trying to teach something that Plato said when he tried to make a distinction between knowledge and truth. And what he said was that truth is the limit of knowledge as the fund of knowledge grows and grows and grows. So as we get more and more knowledge, that limit is truth. Now that's the way he did it, that's the way I'm doing it. Okay. That as you get more and more precise in your instrumentation, the answers that you get will converge to some answer that you can look out and see is the truth. Now, there's some faith in that, but that's the way we build our systems. And so that's what I meant by the difference between knowledge and truth. Now, I'll be fair to Plato. Plato also did the same thing for the good, and talked about how the good is the limit of all of the things that we think are good, and we try to make good. We call them ethics sometimes. He didn't. Ethics was invented later by Aristotle. But Plato actually created his theology out of these concepts of the limit. That the truth and the good he called God. Well, does God exist? In the limit. I'm not preaching. I'm not a religious man. But I understand religious argumentation. And so that's why God is not like the truth. Because God is the limit of the truth. That's the one we are talking about. Now, that's what I had in mind. I'm looking back at the gentleman that asked me the question. Why don't you give me a reaction to what I said?
So I guess my dilemma with it is that what if the knowledge that you're gaining leads to the wrong truth? Say, like in an engineering practice, what if the knowledge that you're dealing with is with unethical knowledge, and it leads to the truth which you see as the truth, but is not the generally accepted actual truth?
No, I know
what
what
if that makes any sense.
No.
Okay.
Well, actually, what I said was, and I used the word faith, that it's a matter of faith that if we continue to make our experiments more precise, that we'll go to a limit called the truth. And that faith breaks down sometimes. Now, I'll give you one that we can probably debate together on. That limit does not apply to Newton's second law. Newton's second law, in the limit as Newton conceived it, would verify itself as the mass got smaller and smaller. Well, we know now that as the mass gets smaller and smaller, you get into a different realm where Newton's law doesn't apply at all. So the whole thing breaks apart. So no, we do not live in a world where we've got it all figured out. But this part about the knowledge approaching truth in the limit it works out for us pretty well, but it doesn't close all gaps. I think we have to learn how to live with that.
I had one. You mentioned that honor is not universal. It only applies to certain people.
Right.
Could you just, in 1 or 2 minutes, elaborate on that?
I think that honor applies to people who are authorized by the politic of a society to impose their free will on your free will. Like a general, like the President of the United States. And the only way that the rest of us can accept all of that, because I think that the imposition of somebody's free will or my free will is something that I cannot say truthfully I accept from anybody. Okay. So what will you have to do to get people to accept it in their hearts? Well, I think one of the things you have to do is create this idea that if you have authority, you've got responsibility. I think that there are 2 types of responsibility. One is, performance responsibility. That is, if you do the job good, you get rewarded. If you're the leader with all of this power, and if you do it badly, you get punished. Okay, but I think there's another kind that doesn't apply to all people with the power. It applies to a cut that in the Army they call the officers, and the others are the men. Kind of got a little bit into that last time. And that is that when you draw that line and say that a person's power over somebody else is high enough that you will impose another kind of sanctions on that person. I call them ex officio sanctions. By virtue of your office, you will burn for the consequences of your authority. You didn't have to do it. Okay. So that's getting to this point here. This is, I guess you see it already, this is Oedipus. And Oedipus has just discovered that after having become the king, that he married his mother, and she was free to marry him because he killed his father. So he's outraged, he's terrified, outraged, he tears his eyes out. That's why he looks like he's blind, because he is, and this is his daughter, ushering him out of the city. Look at the citizens. They knew he did not know that he married his mother. But he's got to suffer for that because he's the king. You and I wouldn't have to suffer for that. Somebody said, well, he didn't know it. But the king has got to suffer for that because the king has that power over us. And that's the only way we can live without somebody having that power over us. He's got to suffer more than we do. And I think that's the origin of shame. that if somebody does have power over you, and the sanctions that the society impose on that person by virtue of having that power is higher than what you have to suffer, then that person deserves a little bit of respect.